Welcome back to another episode of The Culture Bit. I'm your host, Allen Helm. In today's episode, we are joined by two sharp minds in the Bitcoin space, Matthew Pines of the Bitcoin Policy Institute and Nico Moran of Simply Bitcoin. Matthew is a national security expert and Bitcoin policy expert, deeply involved in shaping conversations around Bitcoin's role in geopolitics and national strategy. Through his work at BI, he provides research and insights on how Bitcoin fits into the broader economic and security landscape. Nico is the host of Simply Bitcoin and one of the most consistent voices in Bitcoin media, breaking down daily news, macro trends, and why Bitcoin matters. His passion lies in cutting through the noise and advocating for Bitcoin as a tool for financial sovereignty. In this episode, we cover Bitcoin's strategic role in Washington, the potential for a U.S. sovereign wealth fund backed by Bitcoin, and the recent developments amongst stablecoins and the tie-in to Bitcoin. We dive into how these developments could impact national interests, and in addition, deeply discuss the Bitcoin Strategic Reserve and the importance of Bitcoin having a seat at the table in policy discussions. Both Matthew and Nico will be speaking at Bitcoin 2025 later this year. If you haven't secured your tickets yet, you can go to b.tc/conference and use code BM10 for 10% off at checkout. Enjoy this episode.
Well, let's start off. Chatting about the culture. I mean, we kicked off the new year kind of with a bang here. I know Nico, you and I did some co-hosting for Michael Saylor's 100K NYE event. Pines, I don't know if you were there. I don't know if I ran into you or not. I would
Yeah, I was
assume
there,
so. Dude,
but there
hell
was a
yeah,
lot of
that's
people
awesome.
here.
There's a
That was
lot of people there.
cool to see.
Definitely great Gatsby vibes for sure. I think, sentiment was super high. Now it's not high right now, but we've just hit 100K right into the new year. Trump presidency is in, the Bitcoin president in the US is in. So vibes were super high. I guess, Nico, walk me through, um, you know, your feelings and sentiments over the event as a whole. And then Pines would like to hear the same from you. Maybe some discussions you guys had with some key players in the industry, if anything like of note came from that event. But yeah, I would just love to hear about your guys' POV.
Yeah, I mean, it was a historic event. I mean, not so much from like a if at these prices, Bitcoin. What people forget to understand, right? Like, when I got into the industry, Bitcoin was, I think it was like $700 or $800, right? So a price movement from 700 to 2,000 is almost like a 2x, right? A price movement of 1,000 at these levels is 1%, right? So it's not that significant. It was nice to shoot up from like 60K to 100K, but I think reaching 100K was more so from the significance of it was from a historical milestone. Like, it was a big deal. It was something that we were all anticipating. And Michael Saylor's vindication. I mean, this is someone that I remember at the bottom of the 22-23 bear market. This man was down billions of dollars, and I'm sure he got a lot of pressures. The CEO, chairman of a public company, and he's been vindicated. Number went up. His strategy was proven right. His stock was one of the best performing stocks of 2024, outperforming NVIDIA, like absolutely incredible. Like, Meta Planet's following in the footsteps. Their stock is up 48x. So I think he wanted to celebrate, and I think he made a promise to John Vallis about throwing a 100K party on his yacht. I think it became more than that, and it was a celebration for Bitcoin's success. Obviously, his personal success with MicroStrategy, and there wasn't anybody who was at that party that was lightweight. It was all the biggest players in the industry, whether it was the CEOs or some of the biggest influencers. So the type of people that you would just walk by, whether you're going to one of the many food stations or on the yacht, it was very, extremely well done. It was a great time, and I had a great time co-hosting the desk. I don't know if that's the correct term. The little
There
the
was no
chairs,
desk. There was a stage. There was no desk.
the news stage with you guys. I always have a great time co-hosting with you, Alan. So yeah, I think it was a successful event. It was definitely a little bit bougie for me. That's totally normal. I grew up in Miami. I'm from Miami Beach, So I knew exactly what to expect going into it. But I think for Bitcoiners, that are all about staying humble and stacking sats, it was like, oh my God, what's going on here? So I had a great time. And of course, shout out to Saylor and Eric Weiss for putting together such an amazing event.
Yeah, it was such an awesome thing. I like to say that the organization of that event was chaotically peaceful. I know pleb sentiment on Twitter definitely had their opinion of the event as they came out. They're like, "Who planned the guest list? Why is this person here and not this person here?" And to be honest, I think everybody got their invites like a week or two prior. I mean, to your point, it was like one of these things that was said in jest, and then Sailor's like, "No, let's throw this party. Let's invite all these people," which was exciting, right? There was lots of faces that were familiar. I think everybody had a really good time. I think the vibes were really high. To your point about Sailor, and now it's, dude, I still can't get it out of my mouth that they're not MicroStrategy, but they're Strategy B. Um, it's been super fascinating to see how they have permeated, just like Bitcoin into the mainstream via corporate talking points, right? And how like obviously we all know the money's bad, money's printing away. But for these large, NASDAQ 100, S&P 500 companies that need to, maintain some sort of value beyond just their products, and Bitcoin being that hedge against the deflating dollar, I think is starting to resonate with a lot of corporate treasury officers, CFOs, and next to kin to that, which is incredible to see as a whole. Pines, I know you're, obviously a whole lot more versed on the political dynamics and the political sides, but there's a ton of cross-pollination here between treasury strategies and the strategic reserve. Curious as to your experience at Sailor's party, any conversations that you had, and how that's shaped up the year so far for you.
Yeah, no, I had a few observations. One, it was the first, like, I'd say, major Bitcoin event that I've taken my wife to. And so she's like interested in Bitcoin, but like, Bitcoin is the thing that I'm like, very much down the rabbit hole on. And she gets it, but she's, not necessarily as obsessed as I am here. But it was a unique event from my perspective in the sense that it was plus ones, right? And so you had a much more sense of kind of who people were, right, in their full lives, and you got to meet people's wives, you got to have conversations about their families, and that's not something you typically have right at a Bitcoin conference, where it's typically mostly bros just kind of broing out talking about Bitcoin. And so I really appreciated that aspect of the event, and obviously it was pretty grand. And then my other observation was just, it's a $2 trillion asset, but you kind of had, like, it's a relatively small group of people, like in the scheme of things, that all show up in one space essentially, and kind of all relatively know each other, or like one hop from everybody else, right? And so Bitcoin's this unique culture that started off kind of niche, very much sort of outside the Overton window, kind of its own somewhat countercultural vibe, and is now in a relatively short period of time kind of catapulted to the highest ranks of national political discourse, even geopolitical dynamics. And so I think we're seeing that reflected in the culture, kind of this, and also I think in the debates and sort of the tension in the community is this isn't just my special kind of cultural product over here, like that my sort of nice, somewhat insulated vibe here. And now it's a global conversation. Now there's big politicians getting involved. And that's a tension, right? Like, how do you preserve kind of the culture around Bitcoin that made it special, that kind of was also part of the reason why it was able to persist and so successfully kind of build during the bear markets, is people had kind of that cultural vibe to kind of resonate with and essentially fall back to when number wasn't going up, right? That there was ethos, there's a kind of common orientation. And I think that's an important thing to not lose track of, right? As Bitcoin does, take on these higher milestones and starts to play on a very different level. I think Saylor's party kind of represented both of that, right? You had the OGs, you had kind of the folks that have been there all along for the ride, that have that ethos. And then you have, traditional finance people. You had folks that are, politicians. And I think that's just the way it is now, right? I don't think there's no going back, right? This is always just going forward. And it's going to be very interesting to see how Bitcoin maintains that culture while evolving, right, to meet the new dynamics. So I mean, for example, I had a conversation, relatively brief, with Saylor, and I was trying to be, like talk shop, right, so to speak, and he just shuts me down immediately and goes, like, I was with my wife, I was with some folks that I knew with their wives. He's like, your beautiful wives are here, like, it's a party, have fun, right? And I was like, okay, I appreciate that, Saylor, right? You just sort of pump the brakes on my normal, sort of Bitcoin conference style conversation about talking shop and just like have fun. So it was great being mogged by Saylor in front of my wife. It was a good experience.
That's hilarious. I had fortunately my wife wasn't there, but I tried to do the same talking shop with Saylor just on the Bitcoin for Corporations front, and he said the same. He was like, "Alan, not today. We're gonna we're gonna have some fun," which was good overall. It's interesting. A couple of interesting comments you made on just like the culture overall. Yeah, I think things are just expanding so fast. I know, like when I try to get a pulse check on things, there's some people that are really excited that like Bitcoin's in the White House and that you know the CEO of Rumble is like embracing Bitcoin. People get excited about that. And then on the other side of the coin, I see a lot of people say like, man, Bitcoiners have really lost like the stick it to the man attitude. Like, why are all these people kowtowing to politicians and like, enterprise institutionally focused people? And I'm sitting here on the periphery. I'm like, okay, I understand that sentiment, but what I also don't understand is that I don't think anybody here is saying that like Bitcoin is capitulating to these people, but it's quite the opposite, that these people are recognizing that they need Bitcoin, right? And I'm sure there's some people in the crowd, right, that are always like thinking like, oh, I could co-opt Bitcoin. I mean, that's why we had the block size wars in 2017. Um, that's why, we had the whole whether or not how I don't know how you guys feel about ordinals and runes. I personally don't really care for them, but I felt like it was definitely an attempt to, manipulate some of the core principles of Bitcoin as a whole. But that's all asides. What would you say to people, and I'll leave this as an open question to the both of you, for people that do have that concern, they're like, hey, why are you guys, trying to placate some of these politicians? What would you say to them? I think it's a valid question, but I don't think I think it's missing the point.
Yeah, I mean, so like, look, so I remember the whole pleb movement, like starting, I personally, my own career and all this is I just crawled out of the trenches, and then it just happened that, the simply just kind of just ballooned into something bigger than it was. But I started as, one of those plebs making Bitcoin content. And what I soon came to realize is that Bitcoin is going out of the shadows and it's going into mainstream. It's going into mainstream consciousness and political discourse. And I think a lot of plebs, and I empathize with them and I appreciate them. I don't think they fully understand what is happening. Last year was a great example of Bitcoiners didn't even want to participate in politics. We were not interested in it. And it was only until Operation Choke Point 2.0 started heating up and, the arrest of the Samurai Wallet developers that, at least for me, I obviously wanted to vote for Trump the entire time, but I would on purpose remain neutral to be inclusive in my messaging. And then as soon as that happened, I said, no, RFK 2024 or Trump 2024. I don't think you guys understand that depending on where this election goes, this will have real implications for the industry in the United States. And essentially, like, we were forced to throw our hat in the political discourse. And if you think about it for a second, like, that was always an inevitability. Like, think about what Bitcoin represents. Bitcoin represents the separation of money and state. Bitcoin represents, an alternative to central banking. Money itself is inherently extremely political. I mean, in the Genesis block, it says Chancellor on the brink of the second bailout for banks. So this was always going to happen. And I forget what the exact quote is, but I think it was like from Plato or something. But it was something along the lines of like, if you refuse to participate in politics, then you're destined to be ruled by people that do participate in politics. So yeah, it's uncomfortable for a lot of anarcho capitalist libertarian type of mindsets. But I mean, like, look at the libertarian movement. Trump has done more for the libertarian movement than that entire party, right? So, and I think this is something I'm sure Matt is very familiar with. You have a deep understanding of this. But in politics, and I think Bitcoiners are getting their first taste of this, there are compromises. It's all about compromises. So, a lot of people were let down a little bit with Trump launching Trump coin and Melania coin and all that stuff. But both things could be true at the same time. He repealed SAB 121. He ended Operation Choke Point 2.0. I was talking to Senator Lummis 2 or 3 weeks ago, and she was basically saying, like, look, we're going to get to the bottom of what really happened. He freed Ross, right? So many good things have happened. And simultaneously, it's like the Ripple lobby's getting in there, trying to stop the strategic Bitcoin reserve. The launch of the Trump coins, like, meme coin degeneracy, all of that stuff. So it's like people don't really have an understanding of all of that. And I think it was always an inevitability that Bitcoin was going to get to this point because the asset class is so large. And what is our end goal? Like, our end goal is for Bitcoin to become the global reserve currency or this massive asset. Eventually, you're going to have to talk to some of the most powerful people in the room. And what I'll say is we weren't in the room before Trump got elected. And if you're not in the room, Matt knows this, if you're not in the room in DC, you're not in the deal. We are in the room now. So that means that we are part of the deal. Now, does that mean that we're going to get exactly what we want? No, there's compromises, but at least we're in the room. Last year, we weren't in the room. Last year, I was actually thinking, Opti, I think we might have to pack up and move to El Salvador. That isn't the case anymore. We have a beachhead, and we're definitely making progress.
Very well said, Nico. Don't have much to add, man. That was on point. And you're right. Like, there's these different quips, right? Like, you might not be interested in the state, but the state is interested in you, or, more prosaic, like if you're not, at the table, right, you're probably the meal sort of things. But I do have sympathy, right, for the sense of where to strike this balance, right? Because you can engage, but not sell out, right? You can maintain realism and pragmatism while not, compromising core principles. Right. And so this is the challenge, right? I think at this particular moment here is there's the aperture, right, for pro-Bitcoin policy being implemented pretty quickly by the US government has never been wider. Like, the possibility space has never been wider and also, like, more probable. Right. But because that aperture is open so wide, it's allowed lots of other crazy, from our perspective, like bad ideas to sort of, get in. Right. And then it takes hard work, analysis, and sort of advocacy to sort of steer politicians who are relatively new to this whole thing, right? Like, everyone has their Bitcoin journey, right? Very few people immediately get it, right? Like, everyone starts shitcoining first before they go back to Bitcoin, usually, right? Like, it's a common refrain. It's like, oh, I understand this technology. I'm going to experiment. I'm going to play around. And politicians and these people, right? They're just like me too, right? They're all subject, and they all have their own psychological frailties, right? And it requires kind of, good guidance and advice to sort of, steer things back to where we think is the right direction. And so I think you're right. Like, it was inevitable. But I think where we are now, there is a certain path dependency here, right? That we can, there's openness, right? Like, okay, the dog has caught the car. Now what, right? What do we actually want? What is a optimal outcome for us, right? And where are these new risks that were maybe, entirely hypothetical, right, but are now sort of lurking, right? Is now Bitcoin becomes a national political conversation and becomes a geopolitical, issue. Now there's new dynamics, there's new questions that we haven't really had to answer practically before, right? And that requires, stepping up to a different level and thinking about the stakeholders, quote unquote, to use the DC term, that now have an interest in Bitcoin that maybe just ignored it before, right? And that's good for Bitcoin if you can shape their perceptions in the right way and steer good policy. That's the whole point of BPI basically now, right? but yeah, I also though have sympathy for, and this is like a distribution, right? It doesn't mean that everyone should take that attitude, right? I think you need to have, it's like any sort of large movement, right? Because Bitcoin is both a, open source software project. It's a sort of a cultural movement. It's also kind of a socio-political movement. Everyone approaches it with a different attitude and orientation and objective. Some people just diversify their portfolios and, don't even, listen to any podcasts. Some are like, diehards, right? That everything they own has got, the Bitcoin B on it, right? And that's great. Like we want to have everyone involved. It's not like you need to essentially subscribe to these canonical core semi-religious principles to own Bitcoin, right? Like that is not likely to obtain. And sort of if you want to, make there be hot, extreme litmus tests or like there's a shibboleth that everyone has to pass before they can be considered a Bitcoiner. Well, you're just going to remain a niche asset, and your ambitions for this project are going to be probably curtailed, right? And then you have to hope that the very nature of the technology and the asset, the network, and the culture itself will do what it has done to, I'm sure, lots of us, which is eventually it changes how you think about things, and it steers you, back to where you think you want those folks to be focused. And that means you need to have folks on across the distribution, like the absolute. I really appreciate the absolute diehards that the sort of radical anarcho-capitalists, extremely paranoid, suspicious of the state people. You need those people, right? I'm not saying they're wrong. I just think like you need that distribution. You need that kind of like that forcing function that keeps you honest, right? Along the way here, right? But it's going to require kind of a navigation across these different levels. And I have no predictions. And Bitcoin there's no leaders, right? There's no one who's like setting out like this is what we all believe. This is what we should believe. It's an inherently organic and pluralistic phenomena, which I find, extremely fascinating. It's probably why it's also so resilient, right? Is because there is no, single source of truth, right? Beyond the blockchain itself, right? There is no, mountaintop figure who comes down saying like, this is what I think we should all believe. And so that means you're going to have debate and contention. And that's, I think, healthy, right? You need that. But yeah, now there's new game that's being played. And some folks don't like that game, and that's fine. They don't have to play it. But the folks that are trying to make sure the project succeeds to its maximal point recognize that you just have to play that game, but play it on your terms.
Yeah, for sure. No, I think to Nico's point, it's like so incredibly important that like I'm just gonna say Bitcoiners and Bitcoin as a whole finally has like a seat at the table. Um, And yeah, well, maybe the whole country is speed running shitcoining right now, but everybody's got to learn that lesson at some point. I mean, I definitely find it pretty ironic that after the Saylor NYE event, you get a bunch of Bitcoiners together in DC for the crypto ball, um, and everybody's sitting there, on both sides of the table, whether they're fully in Bitcoin or just in crypto and Web3 as a whole. And then Trump Ninja launches Trump Coin while all the big figureheads that are like trying to decide policy and stuff are there. It felt very on brand for Bitcoin for something like that to happen. And whether or not, you want to be mad about it or not, you have to find some humor in that for sure. That being said, I mean, back to the point about Bitcoin having had a seat at the table. I mean, this really all kind of like permeated, last year at Bitcoin Nashville. When Lummis announced the Bitcoin Act, there was an intent to create a strategic Bitcoin reserve. Um, you know, Trump, leaned into both those promises by creating and appointing, David Sachs as the crypto czar, continuing to double down and say that he, wants to integrate Bitcoin, not only as a strategic reserve asset, but recently from both the Commerce Secretary and Treasury Secretary talking about a sovereign wealth fund. So the seat at the table has certainly evolved some. And I know, Matt, you and the guys at BPI have had a lot of insights into shaping policy or policy recommendations for the current administration. Um, I guess walk me through like where are we at today? Lots of different ideas being tossed around between the sovereign wealth fund and the Bitcoin strategic reserve. Do those two things align with one another? Like what's just going on up in Washington right now?
Yeah, okay, I can give you a brief state of play, right? So Trump came in, he signed an executive order on sort of digital assets, right? Establishing a president's working group. Importantly, like the top sort of front matter, laid out some really good principles, right, in terms of like protect and promote, right, peer-to-peer open software development, self-custody. So like really good, from my point, like signaling of like, this isn't just about number go up. This is about the technology and the individual freedoms associated with being able to engage with it and develop around it. So that was great to hear. And then it provided very specific tasking to the administrative structures inside the executive branch, the sort of National Security Council, National Economic Council, and then a laundry list of federal agencies to write a report within 180 days, essentially evaluating policies that should be either revised, stripped away, or added that would further these strategic goals, and in particular focus on stablecoins and the idea of a strategic digital assets stockpile. And so that is now kicking off, right? That process, right, is sort of kicking off. That now agencies have to write these reports, right? So BPI is going to be very focused on trying to provide guidance and sort of our own takes on those key questions to try to steer towards a favorable outcome from our perspective. And then you had separately, and so that was tasked, right, to David Sachs as the AI and crypto czar to kind of lead that process. And he's obviously like the belly button for all that work and the industry engagement. Separately, of course, you had this executive order on a sovereign wealth fund, which was tapped to Secretary of Commerce Lutnick and Secretary of Treasury Bessent. And you saw David Sachs kind of defer this question about whether to include Bitcoin into a sovereign wealth fund. He deferred that question to Lutnick, right? So there kind of are two sort of parallel policy tracks here when it comes to the role of Bitcoin at the national level. And the sovereign wealth fund idea is probably the one that has been least explored, both in the public and I think even behind the scenes. It was a relatively novel idea of a sovereign wealth fund, right, to begin with, and then it's even more novel that we're going to potentially contribute Bitcoin to it or have Bitcoin be a component of that strategy. So just the other day, BPI sort of wrote like a high level kind of sort of hot take in our newsletter, trying to position Bitcoin as part of the strategic logic for a sovereign wealth fund. So take a look at that. Folks can riff on that. The reason why I think it's really compelling is, okay, the idea of a Bitcoin reserve or a stockpile is really attractive for separate reasons that BPI has written about. But it's fundamentally like inert. It sits there, right? It's meant to be a long-term strategic ballast for the U.S. Balance sheet over many years, right? Provides other geopolitical advantages in the long term, and sort of asymmetric upside is like a long-term option value, a bit of like an insurance hedge. Putting it in sovereign wealth fund is like seed capital, but also as a portfolio asset that is linked to essentially a special purpose vehicle that is intended to deploy capital domestically into these strategic industries, whether it's AI, building out our energy markets, defense industrial base, other national objectives that improve our national security, our economic competitiveness, our technological advantage. Well, that does like two things, right? It like materially does improve our national capabilities and our resilience in the face of a more contested world. But like more rhetorically and somewhat implicitly, it aligns a whole bunch of other stakeholders, right, in the U.S. political economy, whether it's the defense folks, the tech folks, the AI folks, the energy sector folks. It aligns them to sort of be pro Bitcoin, right? Because if Bitcoin is now providing seed capital to this funding structure, then Bitcoin appreciating gives more firepower to the fund to invest in a lot of these areas. So let's think about how to win people over that aren't necessarily Bitcoiners, right? Where Bitcoin can act as a catalyst and a driver for a lot of other potential interests, right? And importantly, does it in a way that is separate from like the monetary functions of the government, right? I think that's where some of the sensitivities around a strategic Bitcoin reserve are. There's folks that are cautious about putting a Bitcoin reserve too close to like the core monetary functions of the government, whether it's parts of the Treasury or parts of the Fed. They worry about the signals that might be sending, et cetera, or like if Bitcoin does run, what are the implications? So if you actually have the Bitcoin stockpile reserve as part of a sovereign wealth fund, it's a bit firewalled off from those considerations, and it makes it very clear this is about strategic investment and our overall economic and sort of national security. And so I like that idea. I think it's clean. We'll see where it goes.
Nico, I'd love to hear your thoughts too. A couple of takeaways I have from that. Yeah, it seems like the signal they're trying the balance here is that they want to continue to strengthen the dollar. And I think, a lot of plebs in the past have speculated. They're like, hey, the day United States decides to adopt Bitcoin, they're just going to print the dollar in mass and they're going to completely shift to a Bitcoin standard overnight. And that's obviously not the case here. I mean, the Trump administration, I think, is very acutely aware that the deficit and just the national debt as a whole is way out of control. You know, Doge, Elon Musk's Doge, and ironically, you know, naming it Doge after the, you know, the hard fork version of Bitcoin that you can print in mass is now going in and auditing all of these, you know, branches of bureaucracy to see where they're overspending all that. I just find that super ironic. Tangential point. But it's obviously an important part of the administration's goals is to cut down our overspending, bolster the dollar. And it's fascinating just to hear overall that you know, Bitcoin's a component of that. But Nico, I'd love to hear your thoughts here as well.
Yeah, I mean, it's definitely very interesting in terms of the strategic Bitcoin reserves initiatives on the federal level and on the state levels. I personally believe I think the state level is going to happen first. And then what's really interesting as well is the talk of the sovereign wealth fund. Now, let's talk a little bit about Mr. Lupnick, right? So there was a podcast that he went on Anthony Pompliano, and Anthony Pompliano, like, no shame, doesn't care. He's like, how rich are you? How much Bitcoin you have? And, you know, he basically indirectly said that he's buying tens of millions of dollars worth of Bitcoin. Then he's buying hundreds of millions of dollars worth of Bitcoin. He also is the chairman of Counter Fitzgerald. Counter Fitzgerald manages all of Tether's money. For people that don't know about Tether, they're one of the most profitable companies on the face of the planet. I think they made like $4 billion in a quarter. I don't know what the exact number, but it's ridiculous, right? And obviously Tether is very pro Bitcoin. So I think it was American HODL that originally said this quote, but it was something along the lines of like, no one is better than their incentives. So let's talk about incentives very quickly, right? So President Trump, according to David Bailey at Michael Saylor's 100K party, and I was sitting next to him while he said this, and it got clipped, and I think Adam Back posted it. David Bailey's like, Trump owns a lot of Bitcoin. We know that JD Vance owns Bitcoin. We know that Hexek owns Bitcoin. RFK Jr., which was just confirmed yesterday, he said at the Nashville conference, I think it was at the Nick Carter fight, they said the majority of his net worth is in Bitcoin, right? So if all these guys are holding bags, right, they're kind of incentivized to pump their bags. Like, let's be honest, this is human nature, right? So I think, you know, this strategic Bitcoin reserve is going to happen one way or the other. I think a lot of us were a little bit disappointed with the initial executive order. From my understanding and sources in DC, there was a tremendous amount of pressure from the Ripple lobby for it to say digital assets instead of Bitcoin. But, you know, we're going to find there's going to be a resolution to that within the next 180 days or 180 days since that executive order. So we'll see what happens. I think just human nature, who these people are that are around Trump, they're incentivized to make this work. But that kind of sounds shady. It kind of sounds like corruption. It kind of sounds bad when you say that. Well, in the fiat system, it would be, because the fiat system is a system of misaligned incentives. So in the fiat system, there's winners and there's losers. In the Bitcoin system, it's a system of aligned incentives. That's why Max Kaiser goes on and he says, you know, Larry Fink or Michael Saylor is the Bitcoin employee of the month, right? So everyone, by following their own incentives, whether it's content creators, miners, node runners, you know, people that work in policy, people like yourself, like Alan, like all of us, like we're creating content. We obviously want Bitcoin to go up. We all hold Bitcoin, but people that buy Bitcoin are going to benefit from it just as much as we are on a percentage terms if they're holding Bitcoin. So it's an aligned incentive structure system. So I think it's going to happen. I think it's going to happen on the state level. I think it happens faster just because I think sometimes states just lead the charge. And in DC, for this to happen long term, right, Trump could have done something via executive order, but the longevity of that is not so great because you're just one administration away from the next president just reversing it with another executive order. If we really want this to, if we really want this strategic Bitcoin reserve to last on the federal level, it has to go through the legislative process. So I know Senator Cynthia Lummis has the Bitcoin Act. I don't know if she has enough votes. I also hope that, this previous election has shown the Democrats that being anti-Bitcoin is very unpopular. Hopefully, the camp, the Elizabeth Warren camp, loses so much influence over the party, and Bitcoin starts to become more and more bipartisan, because that's one of the things that worries me, right? If you saw the the official Republican Party platform, it specifically mentioned that they're going to protect the right to self-custody, they're going to protect the right to mine. The Democrats didn't mention any of that, right? And there was a specific vote that worried me a lot last year in the House, but it was essentially the Republicans passed a vote in the House. It didn't pass the Senate, to essentially ban the federal government from issuing a central bank digital currency. It was literally voted along party lines. The vast majority of Democrats voted against the bill that would allow the federal government to pass the CBDC. And the vast majority of Republicans, I think all Republicans, voted for the bill that would ban the federal government from launching a CBDC. So I think we need more bipartisanship. The last thing we want to happen is it just swings, it swings left to right, depending on which party's in power. The industry's in trouble, the industry's not in trouble. So yeah, I think we have a lot of work to do. On the regulatory front, like what Matt is doing, and then on the culture side, like what me and Alan are doing, to just really wake people up to the reality that this isn't a left versus right thing. This isn't a Republican versus Democrat. This isn't a right or left thing. Bitcoin really helps everybody, right? It's a bipartisan technology. It's neutral, helps everyone equally. So yeah, let's see what happens. I think it's going to happen on the state level first. And then if it happens on the state level, I think it's inevitable that it happens on the federal level. I don't know if Senator Lummis has enough votes. We shall see what happens in the next year or so.
Yeah, and on that point, it takes politics. It takes, which is both sort of the behind the scenes kind of like, okay, are you on board with this? What's your deal? What's your issue? How can we make sure this is acceptable to you? And then there's the grassroots sort of, speak with one voice thing. And what's been fascinating to me is that there's kind of this crypto policy industrial ecosystem that has formed inside DC, right, over the years. And in the last 4 years, there's basically been a lot of sunk cost into stablecoin legislation and market structure bill, right? And I think there's been a lot of sort of personal sweat equity by but the staffers as well as kind of the various policy teams at DC to push those things across the finish line. And now that they're at the finish line, here comes the strategic Bitcoin reserve idea, right? And sort of somewhat scrambles, apparently, like the mix of priorities, like what's a priority, what's not. There's only so much time in the legislative calendar. Bills have to be marked up by different committees. There is now this digital asset subcommittee that Senator Lummis is the chair of. So now there's a structure there that can help advance these things, like on the Bitcoin reserve idea. But it's an unsettled context for, say, a random senator who sits on these relevant committees who's trying to like get a pulse check of like, what does the quote digital assets industry actually care about? And for them, there's not much of a distinction between Bitcoin and crypto, right? This is just one industry. There's a massive portfolio that they have to pay attention to, from banking regulation, et cetera. And so they just want to hear from the industry, what do you guys care about? And when Ripple comes in there and spends millions of dollars on lobbying and PR firms to essentially muddy the waters, it says, actually, the stockpile should be a mix of things, and Bitcoin is just one thing, yada, yada, yada. That confuses these folks. But if you actually have conversations with some of the, like all of the folks that are, running companies or running massive funds or folks that have been in the industry for a long time, it's pretty much a universal opinion that like a strategic Bitcoin reserve is a good idea and should be a legislative priority soon. But that message has gotten mixed and muddled on the ground. And so I think one of BPI's priorities in the next few weeks and months is to just kind of demonstrate the existing consensus and and agreement on the importance of a strategic Bitcoin reserve, and just send that signal to these policymakers, right? And explain why it's a good idea, right? How it aligns with U.S. Interests. Because at the end of the day, it's almost just like you have to make the argument, you have to make it clear, you have to speak with one voice. And then politicians respond to that. They go, oh, I didn't know that. I didn't know that actually you have like person X, Y, Z all the way down the line that all basically agree this is a good idea. Like that changes how they think about the alignment of the industry, and maybe this is a priority. And that is what moves votes ultimately, right? So that you have to do that from the outside in, essentially. So I think what BPI is going to be focused a lot on that. And then we'll see on the executive side, right? That is a similar dynamic, right? The White House is also trying to suss out like who's thinks about what, right? They want to make sure that they're not just getting out in front of their skis. And of course, David Sachs has got to manage both the AI and the crypto portfolios. And like any one of those would be a highly contentious group of people, right? Obviously, not everyone in the industry on either side of those camps like agrees on things and are friends. And so he's got to do a constant balancing act to try to keep everybody happy. So I think that's what you saw, right? Is, at the end of the day, right? Like that's what you get. You get kind of a lot of compromise, a lot of, until you see, uniformity or agreement emerge. Like the default is just not to, step on any eggshells, right? But I think that could change. And I think it's in the process of changing as more of the industry gets organized and oriented and starts to think about seriously making this argument in a very clear way. I think the White House will respond. And so I think it's actually not impossible that you could see, after the working group writes a report, right, due in July 22nd, that there could be very specific recommendations that come out of that could start creating action. It remains to be seen exactly how detailed or how far this will go, but they are taking it seriously, right? This idea of they're studying the issue is not just pablum, like they actually are. Like they're trying to do the homework, right? And these folks have just gotten confirmed. A whole bunch of assistant secretaries and undersecretaries have just basically gotten nominated. Some of them, aren't even in their jobs yet. And those are the people who have to look, say, at the Exchange Stabilization Fund and the Gold Reserve Act, like as what we wrote as kind of the recommendation for how you could create a strategic Bitcoin reserve with executive authority and existing funds without having to take taxpayer money. Okay, that's a great recommendation that we've put out there, I think. But there's somebody inside the Treasury Department who has to actually do the research, write the memo, convene the meetings to do the homework, right? And those people are not even in their jobs yet, right? And so that's the process. Like the DC machine has to start spinning up, right? And start studying these things. And that's what you want from your government. You don't want the government just to YOLO without thinking, right? You want them to be deliberate. There might be why states have the leg up because they have infrastructure, they have people, they have committees that are already looking at these things, and the White House and the executive branch are literally just getting filled out with staffers at the moment. But I think the executive branch is one of these places, once they decide to do something, right? Once they study and have a consensus and now start to issue order, then things can happen fast and can happen at a scale, right, that people are not anticipating. So that is, you get some sort of non-linearities here. And there could be things happening in the external environment. Like you're looking around, this is not a normal administration, right? And this is not a normal geopolitical context. Like a lot of the kind of sort of sureties and kind of basic assumptions around geopolitics, the international monetary order, these things are all now up for grabs this year. And Bitcoin, 2-3 years ago would have been kind of outside that conversation, right? Just kind of doing its own thing, kind of responding, but not actually having much of an effect on those conversations. And now we're in a different era where Bitcoin is now part of those conversations. Again, that's not the center of that conversation, but it's now in that conversation because I think it now has a potential effect, right? And it could respond in various ways and have strategic impacts, right? Folks in the Middle East. I was in Abu Dhabi. I think some folks here may have been there or heard the conversations. Like there were multiple countries that sent delegations there. It was like a geopolitical summit, right? Of how serious is Trump about his Bitcoin stuff? And the word was, he's very serious about it. And we would encourage you to sort of follow our example, basically. And so you have that now kind of bubbling up, right? These governments don't move quickly, right? But now there are national ministers and senior government officials in multiple countries in the Middle East and Asia, even in Europe, trying to pay attention to this, and now have to actually answer the mail to their national leadership, their kings, their sheiks, their prime ministers, their presidents, et cetera. What could the U.S. do about Bitcoin? And if U.S. does something serious about Bitcoin, well, that's going to mean something for me at a national level, and they have to respond, they have to plan. And this is, of course, David Bailey's whole shtick, right? But he's doing it. I think like he's not wrong. Like these conversations are happening, and that's happened very quickly. Like 6 months ago, that wouldn't have been my prediction, but now it is. And I just have to Bitcoin teaches you to always think exponentially, right? Even though your default is to think linearly, right? And it surprises you just when you think it's all stable. All of a sudden, it's entering a new regime. Anyways, that is a bit of my hot take there.
No, it's a great take. I think there's so many things to unpack there. So that the public zeitgeist as a whole for so long has been so black pilled. I think just through COVID and some of the things that were going on with the previous administration. And so they see one negative thing or one thing that they don't align with in terms of how it relates to Bitcoin. And so they're immediately getting into defense mode, right? And not recognizing, to Nico's point, that all these people in the administration that are in decision-making positions hold Bitcoin themselves, and have a vested interest in maintaining the value of said Bitcoin, right? Which is not a bad thing because Bitcoin is a tool that aligns incentives together, which is incredibly interesting. And then on the flip side, we were talking about this earlier, how the administration's aware that the dollar at a global level is certainly being challenged, right? You have the rise of the BRICS Pact. You have various nations electing to trade outside of the dollar as a whole. And Trump's come in here, and he's, instituted tons of policies, has recommended lots of policies to strengthen the dollar, whether that's with Bitcoin, instituting tariffs against BRICS nations, instituting tariffs against companies that choose to manufacture outside of the US. And I just think it's really fascinating that Bitcoin is kind of this connecting catalyst to bring manufacturing back, to strengthen the dollar, to bring back just the economic powerhouse of the US. Not that it's ever really left, but it's certainly being challenged. I guess final takeaways from you guys. I really wanted to get into kind of the stablecoin Bitcoin topic. I know we're kind of getting into time here. So maybe we'll leave it for another future episode, but would like to hear final takeaways of where do you guys see things going just in the course of the next couple of months.
Yeah, so I think initially Bitcoiners believed that what was going to happen in the developing world was mass adoption of Bitcoin because their local fiat currencies were inadequate. They were terrible. People weren't able to save and earn into the future. But what happened instead was massive scale adoption of stablecoins. The phenomenon is happening all over the developing world. People love USDT. They love these stablecoins. And if you think about it for a second, and I'm originally from Venezuela, and I understand, and I empathize. And Alex Gladstein actually wrote a book, right? And the title of the book, I think, is super fitting here, right? Check your financial privilege, right? The reality is that the vast majority of people don't have the privilege to save. They're living paycheck to paycheck. So for them to switch from the Bolivar or the peso or whatever to the dollar is a godsend for them. They're looking at that. They're like, oh my God, they perceive the dollar as gold. It's like $100 bill, down there is, it's put on a pedestal, right? So, and then there's the aspect of Bitcoin's volatility, which we're all big fans of because we have the ability to save. So volatility is good, right, for us. But if someone's just trying to make it month to month and they're just trying to put food on the table for their family, volatility actually is quite scary for you, right? You actually want something that you perceive as stable, right? Which is why I believe that there has been so much stablecoin adoption in the developing world. Now, I'll say all of that, and I'll still say that stablecoins fundamentally, I believe, are a Trojan horse or a stepping stone towards Bitcoin. Why? Because it's an alternative system to the banking system, number one. Number two, they get exposure to dealing with money via digital wallet. So it's like inevitably they're gonna one day wake up to the reality that just like their local fiat currency is a scam, the dollar is kind of a scam too, and all roads lead to Bitcoin. So I don't know if there's going to be longevity in stablecoins. I know that there's many attempts. What a lot of people don't know is that Tether is one of the biggest buyers of U.S. Treasury bills. So I think there's obviously going to be an attempt made to use stablecoins and the adoption of stablecoins all around the world to kind of prop up the dollar system. But even with Doge in there, even with Elon, even with the cut in government spending, like Lynn Alden says it best, you don't stop this train, right? So I think stablecoins, they're definitely going to be popular. They definitely are popular right now. They're exploding. But are they, in the long term, are they going to be a competitor with Bitcoin? I don't think so. I think if anything, they're opening the door towards Bitcoin, where before, maybe that door wouldn't have been open because people were too scared of adopting Bitcoin because of its volatility.
Well said. Pines, any last thoughts here?
Yeah, no, I really vibe and concur with what Nico just said. Two things. Like, one is just on I'm very bullish for Bitcoin, and I'm very encouraged by some of the initial moves the Trump administration has made. But it doesn't mean you just are Panglossian and sort of naive. And I think there are two main fronts that will require persistent work and advocacy, right? One is on privacy preserving technologies to make Bitcoin as private and as useful as possible to keep to its original ethos, not just as digital gold, but as, a peer-to-peer cash system, right? That is global, borderless, censorship resistant. I think that is not something we want to lose track of, even if we are focused, in the near term on, shifting the Overton window around a strategic Bitcoin reserve, which is really, mostly centered on the digital gold properties of the asset, not the network, right? So I don't want to lose sight of that. I think that is not something that is, it's harder for politicians, especially folks that are in power, right? They like the idea of digital gold that I could sort of put in our digital Fort Knox. This idea of a global censorship resistant permissionless network, right? That's anyone in power inherently is going to be a bit uncomfortable with that, right? And so that requires constant advocacy engagement and also technological development, right? There's different layers, there's different sorts of things that can be done on the policy side to sort of further that part of Bitcoin. And then, Bitcoin is becoming geopolitical, and there's all these other things that Trump administration is doing, see, on tariffs. That I was just tracking the news, haven't dug into the ground truth associated with it, but it's concerning that large shipments of ASICs coming out of Bitmain, and I think MicroBT, maybe Canaan, are essentially being interdicted and seized by CBP. So, essentially on the grounds that I think some of the chips and some of those ASICs were associated with a Chinese supplier that is designated on the entity list, essentially as the sort of naughty list for creating an AI chip for Huawei. So you're seeing now kind of this spillover from the geopolitics and the trade war to the Bitcoin mining supply chain. And that's now a tension, right? Trump came to Nashville and he said, I want essentially all the remaining Bitcoin to be mined in America. I mean, that's not possible. But if you're cutting off essentially the import of ASICs, which we really can't really make at scale, or the competitive versions at least, then American Bitcoin mining hash share it's going to go down, right? Relative to the rest of the world. And so there's now tension and contradiction in different policies, right? We want to break and sort of deleverage from our supply chains in China, but there's this massive semiconductor dependency. Of course, ASICs, that's their whole point. And you have this objective to make American Bitcoin mining succeed. And okay, well, we need to surface that contradiction and make policy recommendations to resolve it. And so that's what BPI is for. So I'll sort of finish off with a little bit of a soft pitch for BPI. So I think there'll be big things coming, and we are in the process of significantly expanding our footprint in DC. We're going to be opening up an office downtown that essentially be like a Bitcoin embassy, essentially a Bitcoin node, a cultural node, a policy node to kind of bring DC to Bitcoin and Bitcoin to DC. So we'll be sort of scaling that up and really try to eventually or pretty quickly get to the point where BPI is equal to, if not larger than, all the other sort of crypto groups, right? Bitcoin is the vast majority of what you call the digital assets ecosystem. It's by far the most popular asset, the most enduring asset, and the most widely adopted global network. And it needs to be represented proportionally in DC. And that's not the case right now, right? It's maybe a 2080 in the wrong direction. And so I think first order of business is just to right that imbalance. And that will have, I think, a whole bunch of second and third order effects, right? And help mitigate some of these issues associated with Ripple. But that's the thing, is there's no Bitcoin CEO that has a line item for like advocacy or research, right? Whereas all of these, like Ripples and these private foundations, they really need to try to get their protection. So they have a direct incentive as leadership teams to fund policy work inside DC. So I think that mood is shifting. But I think there's a lot more that could be done on that front. And I think there's a window of time that we have now, right? It's basically now and then basically to the midterms, or like, next summer in particular. Like there's not that much time in politics land, because you never know what's going to happen in 2026. I mean, at this point, it looks like the Senate could flip back blue, and and then you're basically in kind of stasis, right? And not much is going to move. So if you really want to lock in executive actions and legislative moves, it really has to be done basically between now and next summer. And there's a matter of urgency to like then get in the game and move the needle as far as you can and lock it in. So I think that's going to be BPI's priority. But not just on the legislative side, the executive side, but just culturally, right? Like, I think a lot's changing inside DC. I think attitudes from people that weren't paying attention to Bitcoin now are. And so there's a big opportunity just for basic education, right? The 101, right? Just to like what this thing is, what its history is, what its culture is. This is just this, sort of digital crypto thing, right? This is a serious asset, and there's a community around it that has sort of unique, sort of American but also a global flavor to it. That's, I think, an emerging novel institution, and that needs to be represented essentially in DC. So I'm really excited to help build that out. And yeah, when it's open, I think it'll be hopefully it'll be a new node for folks to kind of plug into in DC.
Well, I'm certainly excited about all the developments that are going to be coming from Washington over the course of the next year and a half, because we're in a new era. I think people, the administration's showing that they're quick to take action and quick to move, and they know they have a lot to fix. If you're not feeling white pilled, I think people will be in 6 months. So super excited. Pines, Nico, pleasure to have you on. I encourage everybody to go follow Simply Bitcoin. They're putting out news every single day. And then definitely please go follow Matthew Pines and his team's work at BPI. They're doing the Lord's work in Washington, D.C. for Bitcoin. That's certainly an understatement. But pleasure having you guys on, and looking forward to chatting with you guys both in Vegas later this year and having you guys back on the show next time. Thanks, guys.
Awesome.
Thanks, Alan.
Thanks.
Cool.